I'm not proud to admit it, but life in my 20s looked very different from what I had imagined. Growing up, I always imagined that by now I'd have it all: a steady job, a little savings, maybe even a house. But instead, I was slogging from paycheck to paycheck with Emily, my 3-year-old friend. Emily and I met in college when everything seemed promising. She was sharp, funny, and had ambition that made you believe she would one day blow up the world. But that fire hadn't yet translated into a stable career. Not for her, not for me. She was moonlighting as a barista, and I had a 9 to 5 tech support job that barely covered our bills. Things were tight, very tight. Rent was always weeks late, and utilities seemed like a time bomb. Every month we did the same dance, calling the landlord, promising that we'd have money soon, and praying that the lights wouldn't be turned off. I started keeping the apartment dark to save on electricity. We stopped leaving the house, stopped buying anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. It seemed like we were one wrong step away from losing everything. And then Emily offered a solution. "We could move in with Brad," she said one evening as we sat on the couch eating cheap takeout. "Brad?" I interjected. The name was barely memorized. "You've met him before," she said, picking at her food. "At that party last year? He has a big house in Maplewood. He's renting out an extra room. It'll be a lot cheaper than here." I vaguely remembered Brad. He was tall, well-dressed, and obviously loaded, one of those guys who seemed to have his whole life mapped out. I'd only exchanged a few words with him, but something about him didn't sit right with me. Maybe it was the way he acted, like he knew he was better than everyone else in the room. I hesitated. The idea of living with a guy we barely knew didn't enthuse me, but Emily was already being persistent in suggesting it. "He's offering a room for half of what we pay here," she said. "And utilities are included." That's not a question, is it? Undeniably. That's exactly how she phrased it. Like it was the golden ticket out of the mess we were in. Maybe it was, but something about the way she presented it made me wary. But you can't argue with numbers. So we moved in. Brad's house was just as I expected it to be: huge, immaculate, and decorated with such taste that it felt like we were in a magazine. When we arrived, he gave us a little tour. Gourmet kitchen, spacious living room, guest bath that was better than anything I've ever lived in. Our room was on the second floor and overlooked his perfectly manicured backyard. At first I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. The rent was inexpensive, just as Emily had promised, and Brad seemed polite enough, though a little too charming for my taste. He worked in finance, so he said, and was constantly talking about his investments and the markets. It was obvious that he was very well off. But there was something about him that I couldn't understand. He had this way of looking at people, like he could see right through them. And then there was the way he talked to Emily. I tried not to pay too much attention to it. Not that they were too friendly or anything. But sometimes I'd notice him complimenting her: "You have great taste, Emily," or "You're too smart for that sort of thing." And it annoyed me. She always brushed it off as nothing. "He's just being polite," she'd say. Maybe I was imagining things. After all, this guy was offering us a favorable lease deal. What kind of landlord compliments his tenants? I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was just projecting my insecurities because Brad had a life that I would never have. But then Emily started acting differently. It wasn't noticeable at first. She spent more time in the kitchen, chatting with Brad while I was upstairs. She started getting dressed more often, for little things, like putting on makeup before heading into the living room. And she always talked about how helpful Brad was, like when he fixed the leaky faucet in our bathroom or gave her advice on finding a job. "It's nice to have someone who really knows how to get things done," she said one night as we were getting ready for bed. I nodded, but everything inside me clenched into a lump. The final straw was when I overheard their conversation in the backyard one night. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I was standing on the porch leafing through my phone when their voices reached me through the open window. "You know I appreciate everything you do," Emily said. Brad chuckled. "I told you I don't mind helping, but you have to keep your end of the bargain." My heart sank. "I know," Emily said, her voice getting quieter. "I just don't want him to find out." I couldn't breathe. My head was spinning. My chest felt like it was about to burst. What the hell was she talking about? I lay in bed next to her that night, staring up at the ceiling and replaying the conversation in my head. My intuition told me something was very, very wrong, but I had no proof. Not yet. I decided I had to find out. Whatever was going on between Emily and Brad, it was time to find out the truth. I'm not going to lie, moving into Brad's house was like moving into another world. After 3 years of living in cramped apartments that always smelled faintly of mold and regret, his house looked like something out of a home renovation show. I had always dreamed of a house like this, but knew I could never afford it. It was a 2-story colonial-style house with a perfectly manicured lawn, a driveway big enough to park a small fleet of cars, and a ridiculous front porch that made our old apartment look like a cardboard shoebox. Inside, things were even more impressive. Hardwood floors that practically glistened, walls painted in shades that screamed money, and furniture that probably cost more than my car. When we arrived, Brad gave us a little tour, talking about the gourmet kitchen, the custom wine cellar, and the heated floors in the master bath. Emily, my girlfriend, couldn't stop marveling. She smiled as she followed Brad and caught every word he said. And me? I was just trying to realize that this was our new home. Well, not really our home, just a room in it. Brad was something else. A tall guy in his mid-30s, with an athletic build and a jaw you could cut glass with. He had this casual charm about him that made people want to listen to him. He was the kind of guy I always hated in college, the guy who could walk into a party and take over a room without even trying. When he spoke, he did so with the kind of confidence that comes from having money. Real money. Not the paycheck-to-paycheck money that Emily and I used to play with. And he knew it. You could see it in the way he held himself, the way he made eye contact, and even the way he shook your hand. Firmly, confidently, as if to remind you who was in charge. But he was polite, generous, even. He received us as if we were old friends, not broke 20-somethings who could barely scrape together the rent. "No rush to pay me this month," he said with a smirk as he helped us carry our bags upstairs. "Settle in first." Emily practically glowed with happiness, thanking him over and over again. I muttered words of thanks as well, though something about his kindness made me wary. Not that I could afford to be picky. We needed it. Our new room was more spacious than our previous apartment. Seriously, the closet alone could have been a guest room. There was even a bathroom with a showerhead. Emily called it perfect. I called it a huge step up from our previous apartment, though the fact that the apartment was being lived in by a landlord kept me from relaxing. Nevertheless, I couldn't deny the relief I felt that first night. For the first time in months, I wasn't lying awake worrying about the rent or the power going out. And Emily was thrilled, which made me feel like maybe we'd made the right move. But Brad, he was a wild card. At first, I tried to brush him off. Maybe I was just jealous. After all, this guy had everything about him that I didn't. Wealth, good looks, confidence. And he seemed really friendly to Emily. Too friendly, to be honest. It wasn't egregious. Nothing that I could point to and say, yeah, this guy is crossing the line. But it was. The way he made little remarks about her. Compliments that seemed too personal. "Emily, you have such a wonderful eye for detail," he'd said once when she'd helped him rearrange some pillows in the living room. "I should commission you to design this whole house." Or the time he laughed too hard at one of her jokes, leaning into her as if she'd said the funniest thing he'd ever heard. I told myself I was overthinking it. This guy was letting us live in his house for practically nothing. The least I could do was not act like a jealous idiot. But it wasn't just Brad. It was Emily. She seemed, different. Maybe happier. Or just more energetic. I don't know how to describe it, but she was more upbeat than I'd seen her in months. She started dressing up more often, even when we weren't going anywhere. I didn't pay much attention to it at first. She always liked to look good. But then she started spending more time with Brad. "Just helping him around the house," she said one day when I asked where she'd been all day. I shrugged it off. I didn't feel like socializing with Brad. So if Emily wanted to keep him company, that was fine with me. But the more this went on, the more I started to feel like an outsider in my own life. Not that Emily was avoiding me. Not really. But there was a strange shift in our relationship that I couldn't ignore. She was constantly talking about how wonderful Brad was. Generous, talented, accomplished. "He's just so driven," she said one evening as we sat in our room. "Yeah," I mumbled, trying to focus on my laptop. I guess it must be nice when things work themselves out for you. Emily threw a glare at me. You don't know that. He works hard. I didn't say anything back. What was I supposed to say? Not that I wanted to fight. Things were stable for once, and I didn't want to rock the boat. But the more time we spent at Brad's house, the more I felt myself fading into the background. Like I was no longer her partner, just the guy she shared a room with. Worst of all, I couldn't shake the feeling that Brad knew exactly what he was doing. The way he was looking at me like he could see right through me. Like he knew I didn't belong in his world and was just waiting for me to realize it. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe I was just insecure. But there was something about it all that didn't feel right. And I couldn't help but wonder how long it would last before it all came crashing down. Looking back, I think the first real indication that something was wrong with Emily came the day she volunteered to discuss the rent issue with Brad. I had just gotten home from work, exhausted from dealing with clueless customers, and Emily was standing in the kitchen flipping through her phone as if expecting something. "I'll talk to Brad about next month's rent," she said almost nonchalantly. It was weird, because I'd always done rentals. Not because we had some old division of labor or anything. It just made sense. I had a steady income, and I'd been the one apologizing to landlords for late payments even before Emily and I started living together. But this time, she seemed impatient, even too impatient. I didn't question it. Frankly, I was glad someone else had taken the burden off my shoulders for once. But it wasn't the last time. Over the next few weeks, Emily seemed to go out of her way to keep in touch with Brad, finding excuses to help him out or discuss some things around the house. At first, I attributed it to her just being nice or trying to pull her weight. After all, Brad had gotten us a crazy lease deal, and I figured she just didn't want us to look ungrateful. But it wasn't just that. She started treating little things differently. For example, she started to spend a lot more time on her appearance. Emily had always been naturally beautiful, and she had never dwelled on her looks. But now she was putting on makeup to just walk around the house, and wearing clothes that were more appropriate than her usual leggings and oversized sweaters. When I asked about this, she shrugged. "I just feel better when I look good," she said. Fair enough, I thought. Who doesn't like to feel good about themselves? But it didn't end there. She seemed distracted. Sometimes I'd come home from work, and she'd barely looked up from her phone or whatever she was doing. And sometimes she'd be in the backyard with Brad, engrossed in conversation, and I'd feel a strange irritation in my gut. Not exactly jealousy, but close to it. When I asked what they were talking about, she waved it off. "Nothing serious," she'd say. "Just house stuff." It was the little things that ticked me off. Like the fact that she started spending less time with me, even though we lived in the same damn house. The way she sat in the living room with Brad instead of watching TV with me in our room. Or the way she'd mention Brad's name in passing, like it was perfectly normal to talk about him all the time. "He's just so knowledgeable," she said one night, scrolling through her phone as I lay next to her in bed. "He gave me some great advice about budgeting today." I hummed in response, trying not to betray my irritation. But inside me, everything was churning. Since when did we need Brad's advice? We were doing fine before we moved here, at least as fine as two unemployed 20-somethings could be. And then there was her cell phone. Emily had never hidden the fact that she had a phone before. She'd left it unlocked, like it was no big deal. But now it was always with her. She'd take it into the bathroom, keep it face down on the counter, and get weirdly defensive if I even glanced at it. "Why are you so paranoid?" She snapped at me one night when I joked that she was glued to him. "I'm not paranoid," I replied, raising my hands in mock surrender. "Just making an observation." She rolled her eyes and went back to scrolling, but the joke was memorable. I began to notice other things, too, like the fact that she always knew where Brad was and what he was doing. She'd mention in passing that he was running late at work or that he had an important meeting the next day, and I had no idea how she even knew about it. And she got defensive, very defensive, whenever I brought him up. One day I half-jokingly, half-seriously asked if she was following him. "What does that mean?" She replied, and her tone was sharper than I had expected. "Nothing," I answered quickly. "I was just kidding." But I wasn't joking. Not really. Still, I tried to convince myself that I was being silly. After all, Emily and I had been through a lot together. She was my partner, my best friend. If she said nothing was going on, I should have believed her, right? But that nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. It was like a tiny voice in my head was whispering that something was wrong. I told myself it was just stress. Moving in with someone else, even a guy like Brad, had to create a certain amount of stress. And Emily was probably just trying to make the best of the situation, keeping the peace so we wouldn't get tired of each other. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. I got home late from work one night and the house was dark, with only the living room light on. When I walked in, I saw Emily and Brad sitting on the couch laughing about something. She was holding a glass of wine, her cheeks flushed, and he was leaning back, looking completely at ease. They didn't notice me at first, and for a while I just stood there watching them. Something about the way she was looking at him made my stomach churn. It wasn't just friendliness. It was something else. "Hi," I said, entering the room. Emily jumped up, nearly spilling her wine. "Oh, hey, I didn't hear you come in." Brad nodded at me, nonchalant as always. "Long day at work?" "Yeah," I mumbled, forcing myself to smile. Emily stood up quickly, setting down her glass. "I was just about to go to bed. Are you coming?" I nodded, but as I followed her upstairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just seen something I shouldn't have. That night, as Emily lay next to me, sleeping soundly, I stared up at the ceiling, my thoughts racing. I wanted to believe her, to trust that nothing was happening. But the cracks were starting to show, and I couldn't ignore them anymore. If there was one thing I'd learned about myself, it was that I wasn't good at letting things go. Call it paranoia, call it instinct. When I think something is wrong, it gnaws at me until I can no longer ignore it. That's how I started to feel about Brad. It was subtle at first. Little things that I told myself meant nothing. A casual comment here, a lingering glance there. But over time, these little things began to pile up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Take, for example, the way Brad was looking at Emily. It wasn't obvious, not in a way that anyone else could notice, but I could see it. He held eye contact for too long, or his gaze dropped to her lips when she laughed. Maybe I'm overanalyzing, but it didn't seem innocent to me. Then there were the comments. They weren't overtly flirtatious. Brad was too sly for that. Instead, they were covert compliments that made me feel like I wasn't quite a man. "You're lucky to have her," he'd say, smiling in a way that made it hard to tell if he was sincere or condescending. "Emily has such wonderful energy. She lights up a room, doesn't she?" I wanted to punch him and thank him at the same time. And Emily? She didn't seem to notice, or if she did, she pretended not to. She just smiled and thanked him as if nothing had happened. But the worst part wasn't Brad. It was Emily. She used to always be open with me. We'd been through hard times together, and she'd never been shy about telling me what was on her mind. But now it was like she was slipping away from me. I'd ask her how her day was going, and she'd give vague answers that didn't feel like a full story. Or I'd catch her laughing at something Brad had said, and when I'd ask her what was so funny, she'd shrug and say, "It was nothing." It wasn't nothing. I came home one evening and saw Emily and Brad sitting in the backyard talking softly. They didn't notice me at first, and I froze for a moment, watching them. She leaned forward, her body language open and interested, which made my stomach twist. He sat leaning back and smiling like he owned the world. When Emily finally saw me, she jumped slightly, as if I'd caught her doing something she shouldn't have. "Hi," she said, her voice a little too bright. "We were just talking about the garden. Brad's thinking of planting some new flowers." "Cool," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. I wanted to believe her. I really did. I wanted to. But the way Brad smirked, like he knew something I didn't, made it impossible. That night, I brought it up with Emily. "You seem pretty close to Brad," I said, trying to sound casual. She rolled her eyes. "Don't get me started. I'm not starting anything. I'm just saying it's a little weird, that's all." "What's weird?" She snapped back, her tone defensive. "The fact that I'm making nice with a guy who lets us live here for practically free? I'm sorry if that bothers you." "It doesn't bother me," I lied. "I just don't know. He's a little too friendly, don't you think?" She sighed, annoyed. "He's just nice. You're making too much sense." Maybe she was right. Maybe I was overthinking it. But it didn't feel that way to me. Over the next few weeks, the tension in the house began to build. Brad seemed to take every opportunity to jab me, and always with that annoying smile on his face. "It must be hard to work so long," he said one evening as we sat in the living room. "I don't know how you do it. If I had to deal with clients all day, I'd go crazy." Emily laughed, and I forced myself to chuckle, even though I could feel my blood boiling. Another time he said that Emily was ambitious, and that it was great to see someone with real potential. The subtext was obvious. I wasn't ambitious. I didn't have potential. I was just a guy who was barely making ends meet. I tried to ignore it, but it wasn't easy. Every time I walked into a room and saw them talking or laughing together, a knot tightened in my stomach. It didn't help that Emily was becoming more and more evasive either. When I asked her what she and Brad were talking about, she would brush me off or change the subject. If I insisted, she accused me of jealousy or paranoia. "I don't know what's gotten into you," she said one night when I tried to broach the subject again. "You're acting so insecure." Maybe I was insecure. Or maybe I was just seeing things she didn't want me to see. I came home from work one night and found Emily in the kitchen making dinner. Her phone was on the table, and for the first time in weeks, it wasn't locked. I hesitated. Spying wasn't my style, and I hated the very thought of invading her privacy. But the nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. I picked up the phone and quickly scrolled through her messages. Most of them were innocuous, chatting with friends, group messages about work, but then I saw Brad's name. There were dozens of messages. Most of them were innocent enough. Something about home, jokes, memes, but a few of them made my heart ache. "It was great chatting with you tonight. You always know how to make me laugh. You looked amazing tonight. That dress fit you perfectly. Don't worry, I'll keep our little secret." My hands were shaking as I put my phone back down. I didn't have proof of anything specific, but these messages confirmed what I'd been feeling all along. Something was going on between them, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find out exactly what. It was a Saturday afternoon when I overheard a conversation. One of those lazy, unremarkable weekends when nothing seemed to be happening. I'd spent most of the morning at my laptop, scrolling through job boards and convincing myself that I was making progress even though I hadn't submitted a single application. Emily was downstairs, presumably working on the grocery list, and Brad was somewhere in the house. I hardly saw him that day, which was fine with me. I've been trying to avoid him lately. Not that I wanted to admit it, but his presence always made me feel awkward, like I was a guest in my own relationship. I decided to head downstairs to get something to eat. As I passed the landing, I heard their voices, Emily and Brad's, coming from the backyard. I didn't try to eavesdrop. I honestly didn't try. But something in the tone of their conversation made me stop. They were talking quietly, almost too quietly, as if they didn't want anyone else to hear. I froze at the top of the stairs, trying to make out what they were talking about. Most of it was muffled, but a few words and phrases stood out. "I just think we need to keep things quiet," Emily said, her voice soft but firm. Brad replied, but I couldn't make out his words. Then Emily spoke again, and this time her words struck me like a punch to the gut. "He doesn't need to know about this." I felt my stomach cramp. My mind raced, trying to piece together what I'd just heard. What the hell were they talking about? What didn't I need to know? I leaned closer, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear Brad laughing softly, his voice calm and reassuring. "Don't worry," he said. "I've got everything under control." After that, I didn't hear anything else. My mind was too busy replaying those two phrases over and over again. He doesn't need to know that. I have everything under control. I turned around and walked back to our room, my feet moving on autopilot. Once inside the room, I closed the door behind me and sat on the edge of the bed, resting my head on my hands. What did she mean by restraint? And what didn't I need to know? Was it about the lease? About something else? My brain was whirling, trying to come up with logical explanations, but nothing made sense. It felt like the walls of the house were closing in around me. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. Something was going on, something I had no part in, and it involved Emily and Brad. I thought about rushing into her arms right here and now, but stopped myself. I needed to calm down first, to think things through. If I started firing off guns without any real evidence, she'd just accuse me of being jealous and insecure. And maybe she'd be right. Instead, I tried to act normal for the rest of the day. I stayed in our room, pretending to be busy on my laptop, and my thoughts kept going back to that conversation. When Emily finally came upstairs in the evening, she was smiling like nothing had happened. "Hi," she said, leaning over to kiss my cheek. "What have you been up to?" "Nothing much," I replied, forcing myself to smile. She didn't seem to notice that anything was wrong. Or if she did, she didn't show it. She changed into her pajamas, climbed into bed, and started flipping through her phone like it was any other night. But for me, it wasn't. I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark, staring up at the ceiling, questions swirling in my head that I couldn't find an answer to. What was she hiding from me? And why was Brad involved? I thought about checking her phone, but she kept it close to her as usual. Besides, even if I found something, what would I do with it? The thought of finding evidence of something, whatever it was, filled me with dread and determination in equal measure. The next morning, I decided I couldn't let this go unchallenged. I needed to face her, but I needed to do it wisely. If I acted too decisively, she would get off my back. I had to act calm, at least at first. Over breakfast, I casually broached the subject of the conversation I'd overheard. "So what were you and Brad talking about yesterday?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. She looked up from her cereal in surprise. "What did you mean?" "In the backyard," I said. "I heard you two talking." "Oh, that," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "Nothing important, just something about the house." "About what?" I asked. She hesitated for a second, barely enough for anyone else to notice, but I caught it. "Just some maintenance stuff," she said quickly. "Why?" "No reason," I said, forcing myself to smile. "Just curious." She looked at me like she wasn't sure whether to believe me or not, but didn't say anything else. The rest of the day passed like a blur. I couldn't focus on anything. Every time I saw Emily and Brad together, my chest constricted. I replayed their conversation in my head, analyzing every word, every tone, every intonation. By late afternoon, I was more certain than ever that something was going on. I didn't know what it was yet, but I was going to find out. I couldn't hold it in any longer. All the little moments, the late-night whispers, the sideways glances, the evasive answers, were building up in my head like a pressure cooker. Every time I tried to let it go, something pulled me back in. A laugh that I didn't like. A comment that seemed too personal. Brad seemed to be everywhere, like a shadow over my relationship. So that night I decided to broach the subject. No more games, no more waiting for the perfect moment. I couldn't live in uncertainty anymore. We sat on the couch. The TV was on in the background, but neither of us were watching it. Emily was leafing through her phone with her legs tucked under her and looked perfectly calm, and I sat there, tensing every muscle in my body, trying to think of the best way to start. I didn't have a script ready, so I just said what had been going through my head for weeks. "What's going on between you and Brad?" She didn't even look up from her phone. "What do you mean?" "I mean," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "that you're spending a lot of time with him. More than usual." She finally looked at me, confusion and annoyance mixed in her expression. "What are you talking about? We live in the same house. Of course I spend time with him." "Yeah, but this is different," I said, leaning forward. "You're always with him. You laugh at all his jokes. You talk about him like he's some kind of saint. And I heard you two in the backyard the other day. Keeping it a secret? Not telling him? What the hell was that about?" Her face darkened, and I realized I'd hit a nerve. "You were eavesdropping?" She snapped back. "I wasn't eavesdropping," I replied. "I overheard you by accident. And now I'm asking you straight out, what's going on?" She shook her head and laughed bitterly. "Unbelievable. You're paranoid. You know that? There's nothing going on. We were talking about rent, for God's sake." "The rent," I repeated, skepticism in my voice. "Is that what you're sticking to?" "Yes, rent," she said, her voice rising. "Brad gave us a break, and I was trying to make sure we didn't screw it up. But apparently you're more interested in playing detective than trusting me." "Trust you?" I said, my annoyance boiling over. "How can I trust you when you're always sneaking around with him? When you hide conversations and keep secrets? You're not acting like someone who's just worried about the rent." Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment I thought she was about to explode. But instead, she crossed her arms and leaned back, her tone turning icy. "You're unbelievable. Do you even hear yourself? You're jealous because I'm trying to keep us from going broke. Do you have any idea how stressful it is trying to make things work while you're pouting at Brad?" "I'm not sulking," I said, even though I realized how defensive I was being. "I'm trying to figure out what's going on right in front of my eyes." "Nothing's going on," she shouted, standing up. "But I suppose you've already made up your mind, haven't you? You've decided that I'm the bad one here, so why don't you just say so?" There was silence in the room for a moment, except for the sound of the television, which had long since become background noise. I stared at her, searching her face for any sign of the girl I thought I knew. But all I saw was anger and frustration, a wall I couldn't break through. "I don't know what to think anymore," I finally said, lowering my voice. Her expression softened a little, but the tension was still there. "I can't do this to you," she said, shaking her head. "I can't keep getting defensive when I haven't done anything wrong." And with those words, she left the room, leaving me sitting there feeling like the ground had gone out from under my feet. I sat on the couch for another long time, going over the whole argument in my head. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was being paranoid and letting my insecurities take over. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't add up. Her words wouldn't get out of my head, especially the one about Brad giving us a break on the lease. Was that really all there was to it? A business arrangement that I was exaggerating? Or was it an excuse, her way of justifying what she didn't want to admit? I wanted to believe her. I really did. But trust is never blind, and right now mine was hanging by a thread. I slept in our bed that night, but Emily didn't join me. I could hear her in the guest room at the end of the hallway, the door tightly shut. For the first time since we moved into Brad's house, I felt completely alone. I don't even know when it started, but at some point the nagging doubts became impossible to ignore. They weren't just whispering in the back of my mind anymore, they were screaming at me, demanding answers I didn't want to face. After the fight, Emily and I began to drift apart. We were like two strangers living in the same house. More often than not, she would stay up late downstairs with Brad, and when she wasn't staying with him, she would retire to the guest room without saying a word. The silence between us wasn't just awkward, it was suffocating. I hated feeling like this, paranoid, insecure, suspicious of everything. I wasn't that kind of guy, or at least I didn't think I was. But every little thing Emily did seemed like another red flag waving right in front of my face. The way she guarded her phone, the way she was so comfortable around Brad, like they shared some inside joke I didn't know about. Worst of all, I was starting to doubt myself. What if I'm overreacting? What if I'm seeing things that aren't there just because I can't overcome my insecurities? But late one night, I had a chance to get some answers. Emily had fallen asleep in the guest room. I could hear her quiet breathing through the crack in the door as I passed by, heading for the bathroom. Her cell phone was on the nightstand, the screen dark. Usually she kept it locked and taped to her side, but today for some reason it just lay there, unguarded. I stood there for what seemed like an eternity, staring at the phone. My heart was pounding in my chest and my palms were sweating. I knew I was out of line. Spying wasn't my style, and I hated the thought of invading her privacy. But at the same time, I couldn't continue to live in this uncertainty, not knowing what was real and what wasn't. Before I could talk myself out of it, I grabbed my phone. It was unlocked. That alone seemed like some kind of sign, as if the universe dared to put me through this. With trembling fingers, I scrolled through all the apps until I found her messages. And there it was, Brad's name, at the very top of the list. I opened the thread and the first thing I saw was a string of messages that hit me like a punch in the gut. "Brad, you looked so good today. I couldn't stop thinking about last night." "Emily, you're bad, lol. Someone will catch us if we're not careful." "Brad, relax. He's too ignorant to notice." I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands shaking as I flipped through the messages. They'd been coming for weeks, no months, up until we'd first moved into this house. It was impossible to know what was going on. "Emily, I still feel bad, but I guess this is the only way out. Brad, you're doing what you have to do. And let's be honest, it was fun, wasn't it? Emily, Yeah, I guess you're right. It's just hard to keep it from him. Brad, don't think about it too much. You keep the rent low, and he doesn't suspect a thing. Win-win. I felt like I was going to throw up. Each word was another stab to the heart, confirming what I was afraid to admit to myself. She'd slept with Brad. Not just once. Not just a mistake she regretted, but a permanent, calculated arrangement to keep her rent down. And Brad. God, how smugly he talked about it. Like it was all some kind of game to him. Like I was an idiot for not seeing it sooner. I don't know how long I sat staring at the screen. My brain was churning, trying to comprehend what I had just read. I felt a mixture of emotions, danger, betrayal, humiliation, but most of all, stupidity. Stupid for trusting her. Stupid for ignoring all the signs. Stupid for letting it get this far. I thought about waking her up right then and there, shoving the phone in her face and demanding an explanation. But what would be the point? The text said it all. There was nothing she could say that would make things right. Instead, I put the phone down and went back to our room. I sat on the bed and stared at the wall, mentally going over all the moments of the past few months in a new light. All those nights spent with Brad. All those rent conversations she'd said there was nothing to worry about. It all made sense now. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? My whole relationship, my whole life felt like a lie. I didn't know what I was going to do next. I didn't have a plan, and I wasn't sure I would be able to meet her in the morning. But one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. The sun was just starting to rise when I decided I couldn't stay silent any longer. After reading those messages on Emily's phone, sleep was out of the question. I tossed around our bedroom all night, anger and disbelief swirling in my head. Part of me wanted to leave without saying a word, just pack up and disappear. But a bigger part, the part that couldn't get over the betrayal, needed answers. When I finally heard her stirring in the guest room, I knew it was time. I grabbed her phone from the nightstand where I'd left it and walked in without knocking. She was sitting up in bed, wiping her eyes and looking like she didn't care at all. "Good morning," she mumbled sleepily, her voice still heavy with sleep. I didn't answer. Instead, I tossed her phone on the bed in front of her. "Explain this," I said, my voice hard. She frowned, picked up the phone and looked at the screen. I'd left the incriminating texts with Brad open, so she wouldn't have a chance to deny everything. Her expression turned from confusion to panic in the blink of an eye. "Where are you? How did you?" she stammered, babbling, confused for words. "Don't," I said, interrupting her. "Don't play dumb. Just tell me the truth. How long has this been going on?" Her face went pale, and for a moment I thought she might cry. But then she looked up at me, and her expression hardened. "I didn't want you to find out like this," she said quietly. "Find out what?" I demanded. "That you've been fucking Brad behind my back? That you've been lying to me for months? Which of those things were you going to tell me, Emily?" She grimaced at my words, but didn't deny them. "It's not what you think," she said weakly. "You don't have to tell me that," I snapped back. "I've read the texts. I know everything. Just tell me the truth for once." She took a deep breath, as if trying to calm herself down. "It started when we first moved in," she admitted. "I didn't plan for it to happen, but Brad, he offered us a discounted room, and then things just escalated." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Escalated?" I repeated, raising my voice. "What does that even mean? You thought sleeping with him was a good way to save a couple bucks on rent?" "It wasn't like that," she said, her voice trailing off. "I was trying to help us. We were drowning, and I didn't know what else to do. I thought if I made him happy, he'd let us stay here." I stared at her, clenching my hands into fists at my sides. "So? You sold yourself to keep the lights on? And you thought that was okay?" "I had no choice," she screamed, tears streaming down her face. "You don't understand what it's like to try to hold things together while you're too busy feeling sorry for yourself to step forward." That hit me like a slap in the face. "Feeling sorry for yourself?" I repeated, disbelief sounding in my voice. "I busted my ass to keep us afloat, and this is how you repay me? By screwing over our landlord?" "It wasn't just for me," she said, her voice growing quieter. "It was for us. For you. I couldn't take it anymore. Her words seemed like poison that dug deeper into me with each excuse she made. "Don't you dare try to take it out on me," I said through clenched teeth. "You made that choice. You lied. You betrayed me. This is on your conscience." I turned to leave, but as I reached the door, I stopped. The anger I'd been holding back all night rose to the surface, and I knew exactly where to direct it. Brad. I stormed down the stairs, my eyes red with rage. He was in the kitchen, sipping coffee like it was a normal day. When he saw me, he gave me the same smug smile that always got on my nerves. "Good morning," he said nonchalantly. I didn't waste time with words. In a few quick steps, I shortened the distance between us and brought everything I had down on him. My fist smashed into his jaw, causing him to flip backward and crash into the counter. "What the hell?" he screamed, grabbing his face. "You know damn well what," I said, my voice shaking with rage. He straightened up, his expression changing from shock to arrogance. "Look, man, I don't know what she told you, but dash." "Shut up," I snarled, interrupting him. "I don't need your excuses. You knew exactly what you were doing. You've been toying with me this whole time, pretending to help us while you were just helping her." He raised his hands protectively. "Hey, I didn't make her do anything. She came to me on her own. Okay? If you have a problem, work it out with her." That was the last straw. I lunged at him again, my fists colliding with his chest, and his smug expression fueled my rage. We clashed for a moment, knocking over a chair and sending a shattered glass to the floor. "Stop it!" cut through the chaos in Emily's voice. I turned and saw her standing at the foot of the stairs, her face pale and flooded with tears. "Both of you, just stop." I let go of Brad, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. He straightened up, his expression becoming smug again despite the trickle of blood dripping from his lip. "This isn't over," I said, pointing a finger at him. He smirked. "Whatever you say, tough guy." I turned to Emily, my heart breaking again as I looked at her. "I hope he was worth it," I said coldly before walking out the door. I didn't know where I was going or what I was going to do next. All I knew was that I couldn't stay there a second longer. My relationship was over, trust was broken, and the life I thought I had was gone. The days after the fight passed like a blur, but not the kind you forget about. No, it was something that stuck in my chest like a shard of glass, a constant reminder of what had happened and how everything had shattered. I couldn't bring myself to look at Emily. I couldn't even be in the same room with her without feeling a knot of anger and sadness knotting in my gut. She tried to talk to me a couple times, but I blew her off every time. And what was there to talk about? She had betrayed me in the worst way possible, and there was no going back. I spent most of my time in our room, flipping through job ads or texting a few close friends, trying to figure out what to do next. Just the thought of staying in this house, with her and Brad under the same roof, gave me goosebumps. I called my best friend Mike one afternoon, finally swallowing my pride to admit that I needed help. Mike and I had known each other since high school, and if anyone I could trust to give me an honest answer, it was him. "Dude, you gotta get out of there," he said after I told him everything. "I know it's not easy, but you can't let her or that asshole keep you in that situation. You deserve better." His words hit me harder than I expected. For so long I'd clung to the idea that Emily and I could handle anything, that we were a team no matter what. But the truth was that she discarded that idea the moment she decided Brad was worth more than the trust we'd built. That night I sat on the floor in our room and stared at the empty suitcase in front of me. I hadn't packed yet because part of me still held out hope that this was all some horrible dream, that I would wake up and everything would be okay again. But it wasn't a dream. This was my reality, and the only way out was through it. The first thing I did was gather up the small stack of books I'd brought with me when we moved. Emily had always teased me for lugging them around from place to place, saying I could have just bought an e-reader like all normal people. But those books meant something to me. They were a piece of who I was before all this, a reminder that I had an identity outside of her and Brad and the mess we'd made together. Next came my clothes, my laptop, and a few pictures I couldn't leave behind. One was a picture of my parents taken before they split up when I was a kid. Another was of Mike and I at a concert a few years ago, both grinning like idiots. I left most of the stuff we had in common, furniture, dishes, random junk we'd accumulated over the years. I didn't want any of it. It all felt tainted to me, like it was carrying the weight of all the fights, all the lies, all the broken promises. By the time I finished packing, it was almost midnight. Emily hadn't come upstairs all evening, for which I was grateful. I didn't want to fight again, and I certainly didn't want to hear any excuses about her doing it for us. The next morning, I loaded my things into the car while she was still asleep. It was a quiet, overcast day, the kind that made everything around me seem heavier. Closing the trunk, I looked back at the house one last time. To me, it wasn't just a building. It was a place where everything had collapsed. I hadn't left a note. Figured there was no point. She knew why I was leaving, and if she didn't, it was her fault. I drove to Mike's place, which was about 20 minutes away, feeling a strange mixture of relief and heartache. On one hand, I was finally getting out of this toxic situation, but on the other hand, I was leaving a relationship that had been my entire world for years. Mike greeted me with a hug and a beer, and it was exactly what I needed. "You did the right thing," he said as we sat on his couch later that night. "Yeah," I replied, though there was no conviction in my voice. "You'll be fine," he continued. "It's going to suck for a while, but you'll get through it. And when you get through, you'll look back and realize it was the best decision you ever made." I wanted to believe him, but in truth I felt like a failure. Like I had let myself get played. Like I wasn't good enough to hold on to the man I thought I loved. But as time went on, I began to see things more clearly. Emily's betrayal wasn't about me. It wasn't about what I did or didn't do. It was about her choices, her lack of respect for me and our relationship. Staying in that house, with her and Brad, would only make me lose myself even more. Moving out was hard. Letting go was even harder. But as I sat on Mike's couch that night, surrounded by the few things I'd managed to keep, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. Hope that maybe I could start over. That I could rebuild my life without her. And that someday I would find someone who would appreciate me the way I deserve to be appreciated. It wasn't a happy ending, not yet, but it was a step in the right direction. And it was enough for now. When I first moved out of Brad's house, I felt like I was walking around with an open wound. Everything hurt: the memories of Emily, the humiliation of being betrayed, and the constant replay of every argument, every missed red flag. It was like my brain didn't know how to let it all go. Mike let me crash on his couch for a couple weeks while I decided what to do next. It was simple. No pity, no moralizing, just beer in the fridge and the occasional pep talk when he caught me staring off into space. "One day at a time, man," he'd say. And for a while, that was all I could manage. Eventually, I found a small apartment on the other side of town. Nothing fancy, just a 2-bedroom in an old building with thin walls and creaky floors, but it was mine. It was nice to have a place where I didn't have to look over my shoulder or wonder who was sneaking around behind me. That first night, I sat on the floor, surrounded by boxes, and tried to make sense of everything that had happened. I wanted to be angry at Emily, at Brad, at myself for letting it get this far. But mostly I just felt tired. In the weeks that followed, I dove headfirst into rebuilding my life. I took extra shifts at work and started applying for new jobs, determined to break out of the paycheck rut. I started going to the gym more often, but not because I wanted to get back to life, but because it helped calm my mind. But the hardest part was not staying busy, but learning to be alone. For years, my life had been so wrapped around Emily that I had forgotten what it was like to be on my own. Everything we did, every decision we made, had been about us. Now I was alone. And honestly, it was scary. I didn't start dating again, not even close. The thought of putting myself out there again, of trusting someone enough to let them in, seemed impossible. I had burned myself too badly and wasn't ready for it to happen again. Instead, I started paying attention to myself. I took up old hobbies I had abandoned, like photography and hiking. I spent more time with friends, rediscovering aspects of my life that didn't revolve around Emily. Slowly but surely, I began to feel like myself again, or maybe someone new. That's not to say it was easy. There were days when memories caught up with me out of nowhere, like when I found an old picture of us tucked into one of my books, or when I saw a couple holding hands in the park. It wasn't so much the betrayal that hurt me, but the loss of what I thought we had. But as time went on, I began to see things differently. The truth is, Emily didn't break me. Yes, she hurt me in ways I never thought possible, but she didn't destroy me. She taught me what I should have learned a long time ago. The importance of boundaries, realizing my worth, and refusing to settle for less. For too long I let things go, convincing myself that love was enough to justify bad behavior. But love shouldn't be like walking on eggshells. It shouldn't make you question your sanity and self-esteem. Looking back, I realized that I was holding on to a version of Emily that no longer existed, or maybe never existed. And even though it hurt to let her go, I felt like a weight had been lifted off of me. One day, about 6 months after I moved, I received a message from her. It was short, a simple "Hi, how are you?" I stared at it for a long time, contemplating whether or not to reply. Part of me wanted to make sense of the situation, to hear her admit that what she'd done was wrong. But the other part of me, the part of me that was finally starting to heal, knew that no amount of apologies and explanations could change the past. In the end, I didn't respond. Instead, I went for a walk. The day was warm and sunny, the kind of day that made it seem as if anything was possible. As I climbed to the top of the trail and looked out over the city, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me for so long. I wasn't fully healed yet, and I didn't have all the answers. But for the first time in a long time, I felt hope. Hope that I could build a life that would be defined not by betrayal and heartbreak, but by strength and resilience. I don't know what the future holds, and honestly, that's okay. I'm in no rush to figure it all out. For now, I'm living one day at a time, learning to trust myself again, and finding joy in small victories. And if I've learned anything, it's that starting over is not the end of a story, but the beginning of a new one. And this time I am writing it for myself,